Welcome to Libyth. Today we're continuing with the Tsurezuregusa, and we're going to spend time with the world Kenko wrote from, because that world is doing something important. It is in the process of tearing itself apart, and Kenko's response is to write essays about cherry blossoms and the correct way to arrange a room. That either tells you something about evasion or something about wisdom, and the book characteristically refuses to tell you which. The year is approximately 1330. The Kamakura shogunate, the warrior government that had dominated Japanese political life for roughly a century and a half, is approaching terminal crisis. To understand what that means, you have to understand what the Kamakura system was and why it was inherently unstable. When the Minamoto clan established the shogunate at Kamakura in 1185, they created something genuinely new in Japanese political history. A parallel government, a military administration that sat alongside the imperial court without formally replacing it. The emperor remained emperor. The rituals continued. The court poets still wrote their poems. But real power, military power, judicial power, the power to allocate land and suppress rebellion, resided at Kamakura, not Kyoto. The system worked as long as the shogunate could maintain the loyalty of the provincial warrior clans, and it maintained that loyalty primarily by distributing rewards, land rights, official positions, judicial decisions in their favor. It was, at its core, a loyalty economy. The moment it could no longer reliably deliver rewards, the entire structure became fragile. The Mongol invasions of 1274 and 1281 broke something fundamental in that economy. Japan repelled both invasions, aided significantly by storms, the famous kamikaze or divine winds that scattered the Mongol fleets. But the repulsion generated a crisis that the shogunate had no good answer to. The warriors who had fought expected to be rewarded with land. But there was no conquered territory to distribute. You can't redistribute land you defended rather than seized. The shogunate tried to compensate, but the compensations were inadequate, and the inadequacy bred resentment that spread through the warrior class over the following decades. By Kenko's time, that resentment had been accumulating for 50 years. The shogunate is losing the loyalty that is the only real currency of any government, and it is losing it not through any single failure, but through the accumulated weight of promises it can no longer keep. Into this instability moves Emperor Go-Daigo, a figure who is genuinely remarkable in the context of his time. For over a century, emperors had been ceremonial. They reigned, they did not govern. The actual exercise of power had been so thoroughly transferred to the warrior class that the imperial institution had, in practical terms, become a source of legitimacy rather than a source of decisions. Go-Daigo wanted to change this. He was ambitious, patient, and politically sophisticated in ways that most emperors of his era were not trained to be. He worked for years, quietly building coalitions, identifying which warrior lords might be persuadable, which provincial clans had grievances against Kamakura that could be mobilized. He was exiled when his plans were discovered, sent to the island of Oki, and he escaped, returned, and continued. When the shogunate finally fell in 1333, it was partly because Go-Daigo had done genuine political work to make it fall, and partly because the structural weaknesses that had been building for decades had made it ready to fall. 1 year after the essays are generally thought to have been completed. What follows is a compressed political catastrophe. Go-Daigo's Kenmu restoration, The attempt to return real governance to the imperial court lasts roughly 2 years. It fails for reasons that, in retrospect, seem nearly inevitable. The warrior lords who helped overthrow the Kamakura shogunate were not fighting for a return to imperial power. They were fighting against Kamakura's specific management of warrior interests. They wanted a new warrior government, not the abolition of warrior governance. Ashikaga Takauji, Go-Daigo's most powerful general, makes this explicit when he turns against the emperor in 1336, establishes a rival emperor in Kyoto, and forces Go-Daigo into the mountains of Yoshino. Japan then enters a period of division between the northern court in Kyoto, controlled by the Ashikaga, and the southern court in Yoshino, controlled by Go-Daigo and his successors. This division will last for 60 years. The Muromachi shogunate that the Ashikaga establish is more culturally sophisticated than Kamakura. They become, eventually, serious patrons of the arts. But structurally, it is the same system. Real power with the military, ceremonial authority with the court. Kenko is not outside this. He was a court official, a member of the Yoshida clan, which had hereditary connections to Shinto ritual administration at the Yoshida Shrine in northeastern Kyoto. The Yoshida were not a major political clan. They were ritual specialists, keepers of a specific institutional function rather than wielders of broad power. But that function gave them consistent access to the imperial court. Kenko's position within the court was real but modest, close enough to observe the center, not close enough to be implicated in its factional struggles. He knew the protocols, the aesthetic codes, the social choreography that organized aristocratic life at a level of detail that only an insider would possess. The essays show this repeatedly, in the precision with which he describes correct and incorrect behavior in specific social situations, in the specificity of his references to old court customs, in the easy familiarity with which he invokes Heian precedents. He was formed by this world. And then, at some point in his middle years, he left it, became a Buddhist monk, withdrew from official position, and began to occupy the strange social location of the retired observer. The monk's robe in medieval Japan was not merely a spiritual garment. It was a social position, a set of permissions, a redefinition of one's relationship to every other social category. A monk had formally renounced the claims that secular social life made on a person, the obligations of rank, the demands of clan loyalty, the performance of status. This formal renunciation did not make him invisible or irrelevant. It made him free in a specific way, present everywhere, claimed nowhere. Kenko still moves through Kyoto. He still attends public ceremonies, has conversations with aristocrats and warriors and craftsmen, observes the world with the acuity of someone who knows it from the inside. But he is no longer bound by it. The monk's robe is, among other things, a kind of permission to look without stakes, to see the game with a clarity unavailable to those still playing it. What is absent from the essays is as revealing as what is present. The political violence, reorganizing the country during the years of composition, appears almost nowhere. No essay on the fall of Kamakura. No essay on Go-Daigo's ambitions or Ashikaga's betrayal. The wars, and there are wars, real ones with real casualties, do not enter the text. This silence is not ignorance. Kenko was a court official who understood political reality in intimate detail. The silence is a philosophical position. It says, These events, however dramatic, are not where the most real things are happening. The institutions destroying themselves are not where meaning is located. Meaning is located somewhere else, somewhere smaller, more particular, more durable than any government. To write about cherry blossoms while the shogunate collapses is not escapism. It is a claim about the relative weight of different kinds of reality. His nostalgia for the Heian period deepens this. The Heian era, the world of Murasaki Shikibu's tale of Genji, of Sei Shonagon's pillow book, of court poetry refined to an extraordinary pitch of aesthetic precision, ended formally in the late 12th century when the Taira and Minamoto clans fought their catastrophic war, and the warrior class began its rise to dominance. By Kenko's time, it had been over for 150 years. He is nostalgic for a world he never inhabited, and he knows this. The essays occasionally acknowledge the absurdity of grieving for something you never possessed. But the nostalgia persists, because it is doing something more than commemorating a lost personal past. It is making a claim about value. The Heian court, for all its limitations and exclusions, had produced a civilization in which aesthetic refinement was the primary currency of status, in which the ability to write a good poem at exactly the right moment mattered more than martial prowess, in which attention to the quality of experience was not a luxury, but the central activity of a cultivated life. To be nostalgic for that is to say, quietly and persistently, that the warrior culture now dominant represents a coarsening, not necessarily an evil, but a narrowing, a reduction of what human social life can aspire to. The social world the essays actually observe is considerably wider than the court. Kenko watches monks and warriors, aristocrats and craftsmen, commoners and religious professionals. His position as a monk, who was once a courtier, gives him access across categories that would otherwise be separated by the rigid stratification of medieval Japanese society. But his perspective is never neutral. It is the perspective of the cultivated person who has stepped outside the class structure while remaining formed by it, which means his observations are genuinely wide, but his standards are specific. The preference for the worn over the new, the imperfect over the polished, the seasonal over the permanent. These are available as aesthetic choices only to someone who could have chosen otherwise. A person without the resources to acquire polished new objects does not thereby possess the aesthetic of imperfection. They simply have fewer objects. Kenko's embrace of the faded and incomplete is a chosen position, and the choice is only meaningful against a background of alternatives that his education and social position provided. He carries the court into the withdrawal. The essays are written from inside that paradox, and they are more honest for acknowledging it, however obliquely, than they would be if they pretended it away. The economic ground of the period is not Kenko's subject, but it is his foundation. The collapse of Kamakura, the brief restoration, the new shogunate taking shape, these are all struggles over land, over the flow of agricultural surplus that funds everything, over who gets to redistribute the income from the provincial estates that support the entire aristocratic and religious superstructure. The court culture Kenko is nostalgic, for was economically dependent on estate incomes that had been eroding for generations as warrior power over the provinces increased. The cultural refinement he values, the poetry, the ceremonies, the aesthetic education, was built on a material base that the political violence around him is actively reorganizing. He does not write about this. Some of his silence may be protective, The silence of someone who has understood that the world he cares about is not going to be saved by any of the factions currently fighting over it, and who has therefore chosen to tend what can be tended privately, in the attention, in the quality of perception that survives the fall of governments. The essays are that tending. 243 small acts of preservation, performed in the conviction that what is worth preserving is not located in institutions at all. What the social context produces for the Tsurezuregusa is a narrator who is inside history and outside it simultaneously, formed by a power structure now collapsing, withdrawn before the collapse, observing from a position that is itself a product of the world he has renounced. That double position is not a personal quirk of Yoshida Kenko. It is the specific form that intelligence takes when it is produced by a civilization in the process of transformation, and when the person produced by that civilization is honest enough to see the transformation clearly, and humble enough, or wise enough, or melancholy enough, to step back from the breaking thing rather than fight for position within it. The essays grow from that ground without naming it, the way a plant grows from soil it never mentions. That's all for today on Libyth. One new book every week. At least we try.